4 hours north of Khartoum, there's a stretch of black sand that most visitors walk straight past on their way to the pyramids. It's low, dark mounds running for hundreds of meters next to a 2,000-year-old city wall, glassy and rough underfoot. The kind of ground that looks like nothing until you know what it is. It's slag, furnace waste, left behind by an iron industry that ran here on and off for over 1,000 years. In 1911, a British Egyptologist named Archibald Sayce stood next to a pile of it and made a comparison that stuck. He said the ancient kingdom of Kush had built something worthy of a very specific nickname: the Birmingham of Africa, after England's own iron and steel city. That's the label you've probably seen if you've come across this place at all, usually credited to some vague chorus of ancient historians, as if the comparison were as old as the ruins themselves. Herodotus never wrote it. No Roman author who described Kush wrote it either. The phrase came from one man, on one visit, a little over 100 years ago. And it took nearly 60 years before anyone actually dug into that black sand to find out if he was right. What they found, and what a small team of archaeologists has kept finding using radiocarbon dating and chemistry, in papers published as recently as the last few years, has rewritten most of what that 1911 comparison assumed. How big the industry really was, when it started, how long it ran, and whether it ever actually did what the nickname implies, teaching the rest of Africa how to work iron in the first place. I've been through the original 1911 excavation reports, the 1969 academic paper that first put the word myth next to Meroë's name in print, and the radiocarbon studies still coming out of this site right now. This is the real story of Kush's Iron Empire, the war it fought against Rome that almost nobody remembers, the 60 years nobody checked the facts, and the argument over whether its most famous nickname was ever true to begin with. Kush didn't start at Meroë. By the time anyone was smelting iron there, the kingdom was already old, and it was already carrying a grudge. Centuries before, Kushite kings had done something most people who've heard of ancient Egypt have never been taught. They'd ruled it. In the 8th century BC, a Kushite king named Pierre marched north out of Nubia, took control of Egyptian territory piece by piece, and founded what historians call Egypt's 25th dynasty. For about 100 years, Kushite pharaohs sat on the throne at Memphis and Thebes. One of them, Taharqa, expanded temples at Karnak on a scale even some native Egyptian pharaohs hadn't managed. It didn't last. The Assyrian Empire invaded Egypt twice, in the 670s and 660s BC, and Kush's pharaohs were pushed back south, out of Egypt entirely, first to their old base at Napata, and then, over the following centuries, further south still, somewhere around the 3rd century BC, the royal cemetery, and with it the practical centre of power, shifted to a city that had already existed for hundreds of years as a secondary town. Meroë wasn't chosen for its scenery. It sat in a stretch of savanna with 3 things Napata never had in the same combination: workable iron, ore practically on the surface, enough rainfall to grow real forest for charcoal, and the Nile right there for trade. A kingdom that had just been humiliated out of the richest territory in the ancient Mediterranean world had landed, whether by luck or calculation, on some of the best iron making real estate in northeast Africa. So the reinvention came down to resource geology. A dynasty that used to rule pharaonic Egypt was now running smelting operations on the edge of the desert. But over the next several hundred years, that unglamorous restart is what turned Meroë into something genuinely rare in the ancient world. An African capital that manufactured its own advantage, instead of just trading for it. How rare. By some later estimates, this single stretch of riverbank ended up producing iron on a scale that had no real rival anywhere else on the continent for over 1,000 years. Getting from worked-out kingdom on the edge of Egypt to that took time, trial, and apparently a lot of trees. Rebuilding that reputation started with whatever was under their feet. Literally, iron smelting in the ancient world wasn't subtle. You needed a furnace that could hold a temperature somewhere around 750 to 800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to turn iron ore and charcoal into a spongy, half-melted lump called a bloom, tangled up with waste rock. Then you had to beat that bloom red hot with hammers, over and over, to drive the waste out and consolidate the iron into something you could actually forge into a blade or a hoe. Every single smelt left behind a pile of that waste rock. Do it for a few years and you get a heap. Do it for centuries and you get what's still sitting outside Meroë today. Dozens of slag mounds, one of them alone covering an area larger than a football pitch. For most of the 19th century, nobody in Europe connected those mounds to iron at all. That changed almost by accident. At the very end of the 1890s, British engineers pushed a railway line straight through part of the ancient city, part of the colonial push south into Sudan. Digging the cutting exposed the black mounds properly for the first time, and it became obvious, even to non-specialists, that this wasn't ordinary desert rubble. That's the world Archibald Sayce walked into in 1911. Sayce was part of a small excavation team working the site that year, alongside the archaeologist John Garstang, who ran the dig itself, and a philologist named Francis Llewellyn Griffith, who was there for an entirely different reason we'll get back to. Looking at the scale of the mounds, Sayce made the call that gave Meroë its nickname for the next century: the Birmingham of Africa. It was a reasonable guess. It was still a guess. Sayce was comparing the size of a rubbish heap to the size of a British industrial city from the surface, without excavating a single furnace to check what was actually happening underneath. And here's the detail that almost never makes it into the popular version. Nobody did check, properly, for almost 60 years. The site sat there, its nickname repeated in book after book, while the actual archaeological question, how was this iron made? By whom? Starting when? Went essentially untested. It wasn't until 1969 and the mid-1970s that an archaeologist named Peter Shinney, working with the metallurgist Ronald Tylercote, finally excavated real furnace remains on Meroë's North Mound. 6 furnaces, dug out over 2 separate field seasons, 6 decades after the nickname, and only then did anyone have hard evidence of how the process had actually worked. Later chemistry filled in the picture Shinney's dig opened up. In 2001, the archaeometallurgist Thilo Reren ran chemical analysis on slag and ore samples from the site and used it to put a number on the whole operation. His rough calculation: something in the neighbourhood of 5,000 tonnes of iron bloom produced across the centuries this industry ran. 5,000 tonnes of worked iron is not a small claim for a kingdom most people can't place on a map. So Sayce's instinct held up better than his methods did. He looked at a pile of rubbish rock, guessed there was a real industry underneath it, and there was. But scale on its own doesn't win wars. Somebody has to actually be willing to use it. In 27 BC, Rome had just finished a civil war. Octavian had beaten Mark Antony and Cleopatra, taken the name Augustus, and turned Egypt into a Roman province for the first time in its history. Rome's new southern border sat at Aswan, right up against Kushite territory. For a kingdom that had already been pushed out of Egypt once by a foreign army, watching Rome plant its flag on the doorstep must have felt uncomfortably familiar. The Kushite ruler at the time was a queen named Amanirenas. Ancient sources, chiefly the Greek geographer Strabo, describe her as having lost an eye, and describe her as commanding in her own right, rather than through a husband. Her formal title combined the Meroitic words kor, meaning ruler, with kandake, a royal title that later entered European languages as the name Candice. In 24 BC, With the Roman prefect away fighting in Arabia, Amanarainers struck first. Kushite forces swept north into Roman Egypt, took the border towns of Aswan and Philae, and captured the island fortress of Elephantine. Along the way, according to Strabo, they pulled down statues of Augustus, then Rome's brand new emperor, and by design, an image meant to be untouchable across the empire. One of those statues didn't stay untouched. Somewhere in that campaign, Kushite soldiers hacked the head off a larger-than-life bronze portrait of Augustus and carried it home, deep into Kushite territory. There, it was buried deliberately beneath the entrance staircase of a temple, positioned so that everyone climbing those steps toward an altar of victory would walk directly over the emperor's face for as long as the temple stood. That head sat underground for close to 2,000 years. John Garstang's team found it in December 1910, buried about 2.5 meters down near a mound the excavation records call M292, right where ancient sources implied it should be. Garstang's dig was funded by an international group calling itself the Sudan Excavation Committee, and one of the wealthy backers putting up the money was Henry Wellcome, the pharmaceutical entrepreneur, whose name now sits on one of the world's largest medical research charities. He probably wasn't expecting his money to come back as an emperor's severed head. Garstang's team knew immediately the head was Roman work. What they got wrong, at first, was whose face it was. Garstang, corresponding with colleagues back in Liverpool by letter, initially concluded it showed Augustus's great-nephew Germanicus. It took a German art historian, Franz Studnitzka, comparing the portrait's hairline against other known statues of Augustus to correct the record. The head went to the British Museum in 1911, where it still sits today, eyes intact, made of glass and calci, one of the only ancient bronzes anywhere to keep its original stare. Rome, of course, retaliated. The prefect Gaius Petronius marched south with a force reportedly around 10,000 strong, drove the Kushites back, and pushed as far as Napata, Kush's old religious capital, which his troops sacked. But Petronius couldn't hold that far south, and he couldn't finish the war either. Amanirainus and her son, a prince named Akinidad, kept fighting. The conflict dragged into a stalemate that neither side could afford to keep funding. So they negotiated. Kushite envoys met Augustus in person on the island of Samos, probably around 21 or 20 BC, and walked away with a peace that favoured Kush more than anyone in Rome had wanted. Kushite territory was exempted from Roman tribute entirely. The border was fixed, and it held, more or less, for something like the next 300 years. A kingdom most people today have never heard of, fought the most powerful military machine in the ancient world to a standstill, kept an emperor's own face buried under its own front steps as a permanent insult, and then negotiated better terms than the empire wanted to give, and it could only afford to fight that war because an iron industry, built out of a forced retreat 2 centuries earlier, was still running at full capacity behind it. A kingdom confident enough to do that to Rome builds its temples the same way, loudly. The clearest evidence of that confidence comes from a pair of rulers who reigned together around the turn of the 1st century AD. A king named Natakamani and a queen named Amanitora. Whether they were husband and wife or mother and son is genuinely unclear from the surviving record. But what's carved in stone leaves no doubt about their partnership. On temple after temple, they appear side by side, both dressed in full royal regalia, both shown gripping weapons, both shown physically subduing bound captives underfoot. One relief shows the queen holding a sword and the king holding an axe, each doing the same violence to the same enemies in mirror image. Nobody built that as a decorative afterthought. Between them, Natakamani and Amanitora restored or built temples at Napata, at Meroë itself, and at a smaller royal city called Naka, southeast of the capital. Their signature project there was a temple to a god named Apedemak, a lion-headed warrior deity, shown sometimes as a lion-headed man with 4 arms, sometimes as a lion-headed cobra rising out of a lotus flower. Unlike most of the gods Kush had inherited from centuries of contact with Egypt, Apedemak appears to be genuinely, distinctly Kushite, homegrown rather than borrowed. It's a small detail, but it says something larger. Whatever this culture had absorbed from its northern neighbour over the centuries, by this point it was also inventing its own. They could read and write in their own language too, which turns out to be one of the strangest footnotes in the whole story. The Kushites developed a script of their own sometime around the 3rd century BC, using 23 phonetic signs in 2 forms: a formal hieroglyphic version for monuments, carved in columns, and a faster cursive version, used for everyday writing, that even included a punctuation mark functioning like a word separator. Centuries before that was common practice almost anywhere else. For close to 1500 years after Meroë fell silent, nobody outside Sudan could read a word of it. Then, working between roughly 1907 and 1911, the same Francis Llewellyn Griffith, who'd been quietly working alongside Garstang and Sayce, cracked part of the puzzle. By comparing royal names written in Meroitic against the same names already known from Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions, Griffith worked out the sound value of all 23 signs. And, after nearly 15 centuries of silence, scholars could suddenly sound out Meroitic text out loud again. But sounding out a word isn't the same as knowing what it means. Nobody has ever found a Meroitic equivalent of the Rosetta Stone, a text written in both Meroitic and some already understood language, side by side. So more than a century after Griffith's breakthrough, we can read Meroitic funerary texts and royal inscriptions out loud, correctly, syllable by syllable, and still not reliably know what most of them are actually saying. There's real recent movement here, worth naming. The French linguist Claude Rilly has argued, using comparative work across the region's language families, that Meroitic likely belongs to a branch of the Nilo-Saharan languages related to modern Nubian speech, which opens a real path toward eventually understanding what these texts actually say, past simply sounding them out. That work is still ongoing. So how does a kingdom this confident, this literate, and this economically dominant come to an end? Here's the version most casual accounts give. Meroë declined, and Aksum, a rising kingdom based in the Ethiopian highlands, delivered the finishing blow. Sometime around 350 AD, King Izana of Aksum marched an army into Kushite territory. And that was that. Historians are still actively arguing about how it actually happened, and the argument gets complicated fast. Start with the Aksum story itself. Izana did lead a documented campaign into the region, and he left behind a lengthy victory inscription describing it. But that inscription is explicitly about defeating a group called the Noba, not about conquering the kingdom of Kush by name. Some specialists, including the historian Michael Zach at the University of Vienna, have argued that Meroë as a functioning kingdom may have already been gone, or at least badly weakened, by the time Izana's famous campaign happened, possibly following an earlier, less well-known Aksumite expedition under an earlier king named Usanas, who appears to have reached Meroë itself and left his own victory monuments there decades before Izana's more famous campaign. In other words, the single dramatic military defeat that shows up in most retellings might actually be historians reading a death blow into an inscription that's more likely describing something closer to mopping up. There's a second theory that has nothing to do with armies at all. Trade. As Aksum grew, it built its wealth on Red Sea shipping routes running through its own ports, routes that increasingly bypassed the Nile corridor entirely. Meroë's whole economic model, going back centuries, depended on controlling river trade, running north to Egypt and the Mediterranean. If merchants and goods could reach the same markets faster by sea, through Aksumite ports, the kingdom's core economic advantage would have weakened years, maybe generations, before any army showed up. And there's a third theory, more speculative, but worth naming honestly. The industry may have partly undercut itself. Smelting iron at industrial scale for the better part of 1,000 years takes enormous quantities of charcoal, which means enormous quantities of wood, and experimental reconstructions of ancient bloomery furnaces have confirmed just how wood-hungry the process really is. Centuries of that concentrated on one stretch of the Nile could plausibly have degraded the land around the capital badly enough to strain its own food and timber supply. It's a harder theory to prove than the other two, since nobody has nailed down the ancient tree cover with the same precision as the metal itself. But it's a real possibility, not a throwaway line. None of these theories cancel each other out. Aksum's military pressure, a slow economic bleed toward Red Sea trade, and possibly generations of environmental strain could all have been happening at once, each one making the others worse. Even the end turns out to be blurry at the edges. Radiocarbon dates from one of the last active furnace workshops at Meroë show iron production continuing into roughly 400 to 430 AD. Decades after the kingdom's political collapse is usually dated, the people still making iron there apparently hadn't gotten the memo that their civilization was supposed to be over. Out of the wreckage of the Old Kingdom, 3 new Nubian states eventually took shape along the same stretch of the Nile: Nobadia, Makuria, and Alodia, states that would go on to have their own long, largely separate history, including Christian kingdoms that outlasted the Roman Empire that once tried to invade them. The kingdom went quiet after that. But the story of how the outside world found it again, centuries later, is almost as strange as anything that happened while it was still standing. By the time Europe rediscovered Meroë, the kingdom had been gone for well over 1,000 years, and nobody outside Northeast Africa had a clear idea it had ever existed at this scale. The first Westerner to formally record seeing the ruins was a Scottish adventurer named James Bruce, who passed through the region in 1772 while chasing what he believed was the source of the Nile. Bruce sketched what he saw and moved on. His account, published years later, barely registered as more than a curiosity. It took another Egyptian military campaign to bring anyone back. In 1821, the ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, sent an army south to conquer Sudan, and a French mineralogist named Frédéric Caillouet managed to attach himself to the expedition. Qiyaud and a companion travelled under Turkish names and disguise, Qiyaud going by Murad Effendi, partly for safety, and partly because a European wandering the desert, asking questions about ancient ruins, tended to attract the wrong kind of attention. At dawn on the 25th of April, 1821, Caillouet finally stood in front of the pyramid field. He spent a fortnight there, sketching and measuring everything he could, and published his findings a few years later as a lavishly illustrated multi-volume account. Those illustrations turned out to matter more than anyone could have guessed at the time, because they're the last clear record of what the pyramids looked like before somebody showed up with gunpowder. That somebody was an Italian named Giuseppe Fellini, a former military doctor who had drifted into the Egyptian army, and then out of it entirely, Fellini partnered with an Albanian merchant named Antonio Stefani to fund an expedition of his own, and the two of them set out for Meroë in August 1834. Kushite pyramids weren't built with the kind of accessible internal chambers Egyptian ones have, so instead of tunnelling in, Fellini simply started taking the tops off. He dismantled several smaller pyramids first, then moved on to the tallest one in the whole necropolis, the tomb of a queen named Amani Shakato, who happened to be Amanirenas' own successor on the Kushite throne. Near the top, his crew found a small hidden chamber packed with gold and silver jewellery, close to 150 pieces in all. Fellini's real problem turned out to be selling it. When he brought the collection back to Europe, several institutions, reportedly including the British Museum, took one look and assumed it was fake. Nobody could believe a kingdom in the middle of Sudan had produced gold work this sophisticated. It took another decade and another visitor to Meroë, the Prussian archaeologist Carl Richard Lepsius, to confirm the jewellery was exactly what it claimed to be. By then, word of Fellini's discovery had already done its damage elsewhere on the site. Passing through in 1844, Lepsius noted that Fellini's find was still the talk of the region, and that the story alone had inspired a wave of imitators who spent the intervening years wrecking pyramids of their own, chasing a second stroke of luck that never came. Today, what survived of Amanishakato's treasure is split between museums in Berlin and Munich. So even the rediscovery of this place has its own pattern of getting things wrong before getting them right. A statue mistaken for the wrong emperor, a treasure mistaken for a forgery, a nickname mistaken for settled history. Historians have spent 2 centuries arguing over what Meroë actually was, and it turns out they've spent almost as long getting the details wrong first and fixing them later, one inconvenient piece of evidence at a time. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists writing about African metallurgy assumed iron technology had spread into the continent from outside it, along one of 2 routes: across the Sahara from Carthage into West Africa, or south from Meroë into Central and Eastern Africa. Under that theory, Meroë's importance went well beyond its own borders. It was cast as a kind of mother site, a place that had taught huge parts of a continent how to make iron in the first place. That's the assumption baked into calling it the Birmingham of Africa, the way most people have used the phrase since. This was supposedly the place the rest of the continent learned the craft from. In 1969, the Canadian archaeologist Bruce Trigger, who'd spent years specialising in Nubian archaeology, published a paper that took direct aim at that idea. Its title did not hedge: The Myth of Meroë and the African Iron Age. Trigger argued, using radiocarbon dates that had just come out of sites in East Africa, that iron working there looked too old to have been taught by Meroë at all. If those dates held up, the whole diffusion story, the idea that this one place had exported the technology outward, couldn't be right. Here's the part that almost never gets mentioned alongside Trigger's paper. Those specific radiocarbon dates he leaned on later turned out to be unreliable. Subsequent research has walked a lot of that ultra-early East African dating back considerably, and the honest state of the field on Meroë's specific relationship to East African ironworking is still, genuinely, an open argument among specialists today. Trigger wasn't wrong that the old diffusion story was too simple. He may have been reaching the right conclusion from evidence that wouldn't survive its own follow-up. Meanwhile, a completely separate line of research was quietly settling a related argument out west. Sites across West Africa, including work by the French archaeologist Gérard Quechon at the Termit Massif in Niger, along with findings from Nigeria, Senegal, Mali, and beyond, have pushed the case for independent invention, not diffusion from anywhere, hard enough that it's now close to a consensus position. The Senegalese archaeologist Hamadi Bokum has gone as far as saying that, given the current state of the evidence, there's essentially no case left for any theory that African ironworking depended on outside contact at all. That debate just didn't close in Meroë's favour. West Africa, on current evidence, worked out iron smelting on its own. So by the early 21st century, the Birmingham of Africa story was sitting in an odd position. Genuinely a huge industrial site, almost certainly not the birthplace of iron for the rest of the continent, and still not properly excavated by modern standards. That's the gap a British Qatari research programme, has spent the last decade and a half trying to close. Since around 2011, the archaeometallurgist Jane Humphreys has led a team digging into Meroë's slag heaps, using methods Sayce, Garstang, or even Shinny never had access to. Ground-penetrating survey work, systematic sampling, and precise radiocarbon dating rather than surface guesswork. The results have kept complicating the story further. In a 2017 study with the archaeologist Thomas Scheibner, Humphreys' team published 97 new radiocarbon dates from Meroë's slag heaps. Taken together, those dates suggest iron production here ran for over 1,000 years and might have started earlier than almost anyone assumed, potentially as far back as the era of Kush's 25th dynasty pharaohs, centuries before Meroë even became the political capital. One of the earliest dated heaps clustered its radiocarbon readings in the 7th and 6th centuries BC. That's earlier than the around 500 BC figure you'll see in a lot of general references, including, honestly, the working assumption this script started with. The actual radiocarbon evidence now points earlier still. The honest headline in 2026 is that a claim made from the surface of a mound in 1911 turned out to describe something real, just not in the shape anyone guessed at the time. Bigger in some ways, older in others, almost certainly not the single source it was once given credit for, and still being measured and argued over right now by researchers with degrees in archaeometallurgy instead of Egyptology, using equipment that didn't exist when the nickname was coined. Kush really did run one of the largest, longest-lived iron industries in the ancient world, for well over 1,000 years, likely starting earlier than the popular version claims. It really did fight the Roman Empire to a standstill and bury an emperor's face under its own temple steps. It built monuments in its own name to its own gods in its own alphabet, one that we can pronounce today and still can't fully translate, and its most famous nickname was never handed down from antiquity. It came from one archaeologist's educated guess in 1911, a guess that took 60 years to test, and is, in some very real sense, still being tested right now. Meroë's afterlife, the story of how the outside world came to know about it at all, is almost as strange as the kingdom itself. Europe ignored the place for well over 1,000 years. A Scottish explorer, chasing the source of the Nile, rediscovered it in the 1770s. A treasure hunter blew part of it apart with gunpowder 6 decades later, and his own find was initially dismissed as fake jewellery. A Victorian scholar reduced the whole industry to a catchy nickname while standing next to a railway cutting. And only now, slowly, through unglamorous work with radiocarbon samples and geophysical survey equipment, is it actually being read for what the evidence says, instead of what the legend implied. That work is unfolding in the present tense, and it's unfolding somewhere genuinely difficult right now. Sudan has been in a civil war since April 2023. As of the most recent reporting from the site this year, the pyramid field itself has largely avoided direct fighting, thanks mostly to where it happens to sit on the map. The temples at Naka and Musa Warat Es-Sufra, the same religious complex Natakamani and Amanitora helped build, were not so lucky. Both were reportedly struck by airstrikes in January 2024. The National Museum in Khartoum, which held generations of finds from this exact kingdom, was occupied and, by the accounts of Sudan's own antiquities officials, largely stripped. And yet, as of this spring, a groundskeeper named Mustafa Ahmed Mustafa, continuing work his own family has done for generations, was still reported walking the site daily. The latest in a long line of people who've decided this place is worth standing guard over. A kingdom that spent over 1,000 years being underestimated is right now still in the process of finally being counted accurately. That process isn't finished. It might not be for a long time. If there's a lost empire or a rewritten history you want dug into next, you know where the comments are. Until then,